Before we begin, I need you to understand something. This is not simply a story about a drug. It is not merely a tale of addiction, of crime, or of the countless lives destroyed in its wake. No, what we are about to explore tonight is something far more profound. This is a story about a small white rock, no larger than a pebble you might find on a gravel road, that managed to bring the most powerful nation on earth to its knees. This is a story about how chemistry, poverty, politics, and human desperation collided to create what many historians now consider the most devastating drug epidemic in American history. We are going to trace a journey that begins in the misty peaks of the Andes Mountains, where ancient peoples first discovered the remarkable powers hidden within a simple green leaf. And we will follow that journey across centuries and continents, through laboratories and living rooms, through presidential administrations and prison cells, until we arrive at the world we inhabit today. A world still haunted by the echoes of what crack cocaine left behind. Before you settle in, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel if you find value in these late-night journeys through history. Let me know in the comments where you are watching from and what time it is there. It always amazes me how many of us find ourselves awake in these quiet hours, seeking understanding in the stories of the past. Now, phone away, distractions silenced. Let's begin. In the beginning, there was a leaf. Not the coca leaf that would eventually yield cocaine and then crack, but rather a concept. The concept that certain plants, certain gifts of nature, possessed powers beyond simple nutrition. Our story truly begins high in the Andes Mountains of South America, in a time before written history, in an era when the ancestors of the Inca had not yet built their great empire, when the mountains themselves seemed to touch the heavens, and the air grew so thin that simply breathing became an act of conscious effort. Picture it now. The year is approximately 3,000 years before the Common Era. The sun rises over peaks that stretch higher than 14,000 feet, painting the snow-capped summits in shades of gold and rose. A small group of people, wrapped in woven textiles dyed with natural pigments of deep red and earthy brown, make their way along a narrow mountain path. They carry with them bundles of trade goods, perhaps obsidian for tools, perhaps dried fish from the distant coast. The journey ahead is long. The altitude is punishing. Every step requires effort. Every breath feels insufficient. But one among them knows a secret. From a small pouch tied at his waist, he withdraws a handful of dark green leaves, their surfaces waxy and thick. He places them carefully into his mouth, tucking them between his cheek and gum, and begins to chew. Within minutes, something remarkable happens. The burning in his lungs subsides. The heaviness in his legs lightens. The fatigue that had been settling into his bones seems to lift, replaced by a gentle warmth and a quiet energy that allows him to continue forward where others might have collapsed. This is the coca leaf. This is where our story begins. The first chapter of this story takes us deep into the ancient civilizations of South America, to a world that existed thousands of years before Europeans would set foot on these shores, to a world that understood the coca leaf not as a source of recreation, but as a sacred gift from the gods themselves. Archaeological evidence suggests that coca leaf chewing, a practice known as aculico or chakchar, dates back at least 8,000 years in the Andean region. Excavations in Ecuador, Peru, and Bolivia have uncovered ancient burial sites containing traces of coca leaves, ceramic figurines depicting individuals with the characteristic bulging cheek of a coca chewer, and lime pots used to activate the leaves' alkaloids. These were not casual discoveries. They were fundamental to understanding that coca was woven into the very fabric of Andean civilization from its earliest days. The people of the Andes did not have writing in the way we understand it, but they had memory. They had oral traditions passed down through countless generations, and those traditions spoke of the coca leaf with a reverence that bordered in worship. The Inca Empire, which rose to dominance in the 13th century and eventually stretched across much of western South America, elevated coca to the status of divine substance. The Inca called themselves the children of Inti, the sun god, and they believed that coca was a gift from Mama Coca, a goddess who had offered her leaves to ease the suffering of humanity. But here is what made coca truly remarkable in Incan society. It was not available to everyone. For much of the empire's history, coca was reserved exclusively for the nobility, the priests, and the Sapa Inca himself, the god-king who ruled from the capital city of Cusco. Ordinary citizens could not legally possess or consume coca leaves. To do so was to commit an offense against the social order, against the very structure of the universe as the Inca understood it. Coca was power. Coca was privilege. Coca was the physical manifestation of the divine favor that elevated some men above others. Consider for a moment the ceremonies that surrounded coca's use. In the great temples of Cusco, where walls were plated with sheets of gold that caught the mountain sunlight, priests would gather to perform rituals of astonishing complexity. They would burn coca leaves as offerings to the gods, watching the smoke rise toward the heavens, carrying their prayers and supplications upward. They would chew coca before entering trance states that allowed them to commune with the supernatural, to receive visions, to divine the future. Warriors were given coca before battle, their fatigue banished, their courage enhanced, their fear diminished into something manageable, something that could be pushed aside. Warriors known as chasquis would run incredible distances along the mountain roads, their endurance fueled by the steady chewing of coca leaves, carrying information across the empire at speeds that would not be matched until the arrival of modern transportation. The empire itself, in many ways, ran on coca. It was not merely a drug, it was infrastructure, it was religion. It was the binding force that held together a civilization spanning nearly 2,000 miles. But then something changed. Something arrived on the shores of South America that would shatter this world and transform the coca leaf from sacred substance to something altogether different. The year is 1532, and a Spanish conquistador named Francisco Pizarro has landed on the coast of Peru with fewer than 200 men. What followed was one of history's most dramatic conquests. Within a year, the Sapa Inca Atahualpa would be dead, executed after paying the largest ransom in human history, a room filled with gold and silver that reached higher than a man could stretch his arms. The Inca Empire, which had seemed so permanent, so powerful, so blessed by the gods, collapsed with a speed that defied comprehension. And in the aftermath, the Spanish conquistadors and the missionaries who followed them turned their attention to every aspect of Incan life, including the mysterious green leaf that seemed so important to the native population. Initially, the Spanish reaction to coca was one of horror and condemnation. Catholic priests declared that coca was an instrument of the devil, a tool that Satan used to keep the indigenous people in a state of pagan delusion. The church mounted campaigns to eradicate coca cultivation, to destroy the plantations that dotted the mountain slopes, to stamp out the practice of coca chewing entirely. These campaigns failed utterly, and their failure reveals something important about the relationship between colonizers and the colonized. You see, the Spanish may have despised coca on religious grounds, but they quickly discovered something that complicated their moral objections. Coca made the indigenous workers more productive. In the silver mines of Potosi, one of the richest deposits of precious metal ever discovered on Earth, indigenous laborers were forced to work in conditions that can only be described as hellish. They descended into tunnels that reached deep into the mountain, where the air was thick with dust and poison, where temperatures could swing from freezing to sweltering, where accidents were common and death was a constant companion. The Spanish mine owners noticed that workers who chewed coca leaves could work longer hours, needed less food, complained less about the cold and the altitude, and died only slightly faster than those who did not. This was not, of course, because coca was protecting them. It was because coca was masking the symptoms of their suffering, allowing their bodies to be pushed beyond natural limits. But the Spanish did not concern themselves with such distinctions. They saw productivity. They saw profit. And so, rather than eliminate coca, they institutionalized it. By the mid-16th century, the colonial authorities had completely reversed their position on coca. The church still grumbled about its pagan associations, but the colonial government began taxing coca production, licensing coca merchants, and ensuring a steady supply of leaves to the mining regions. Some estimates suggest that the coca trade became the second most valuable commodity in the colonial economy, surpassed only by the silver it helped to extract. The colonial government took a 10% tax on all coca sales, and individual entrepreneurs became wealthy beyond imagination by controlling the trade. The indigenous people, meanwhile, found that a practice which had once been reserved for their elite was now not only permitted, but encouraged, though for reasons that served their oppressors rather than themselves. This is the first of many bitter ironies in our story. The substance that would eventually devastate communities of color in 20th century America began its journey toward that destiny when European colonizers discovered that it could be used to exploit indigenous labor. The second chapter of our story reveals how coca crossed the Atlantic and caught the attention of European scientists who would transform a sacred leaf into a purified chemical compound. For centuries after the Spanish conquest, coca remained largely a South American phenomenon. European travelers would occasionally mention it in their accounts, describing the remarkable endurance of indigenous porters and miners, but the leaf itself did not travel well. Unlike dried tobacco or roasted coffee beans, coca leaves lost their potency quickly when separated from the plants that bore them. The active ingredient, whatever it might be, seemed to fade with time and distance. This meant that Europeans could read about coca's effects without ever experiencing them directly, and for many years coca remained a curiosity rather than a commodity. But then came the 19th century, an era of unprecedented scientific inquiry, when European chemists were systematically cataloging and analyzing every substance they could get their hands on, seeking to understand the fundamental building blocks of the natural world. In 1855, a German chemist named Friedrich Gaedke became the first to successfully extract the active alkaloid from coca leaves. He called his discovery erythroxylene, a name derived from the scientific classification of the coca plant. His extraction was crude, impure, and difficult to replicate, but it proved that coca's power could be concentrated and isolated. 5 years later, in 1860, another German chemist named Albert Niemann refined the extraction process and produced a much purer sample of the alkaloid. Niemann worked at the University of Göttingen, and his laboratory must have been a remarkable sight in those days. Glass vessels and copper tubes, burners and condensers, the air thick with solvents and chemicals. When he finally held his purified crystal in his hands, white and glistening, he gave it a new name. He called it cocaine. Niemann noted in his papers that when he touched the cocaine crystals to his tongue went numb. This was the first recorded observation of cocaine's anesthetic properties, a discovery that would have enormous implications for medicine. But Niemann died of a respiratory illness the next year at just 26 years of age, and the full potential of his discovery would not be realized for decades. It is strange to contemplate how history turns on such moments. Had Niemann lived longer, had he continued his research, perhaps the story of cocaine would have unfolded differently. But he did not live, and so the thread of discovery passed to other hands.
The true popularization of cocaine came through an unlikely source, a wine. In 1863, a Corsican chemist named Angelo Mariani created a preparation he called Vin Mariani, a Bordeaux wine infused with coca leaves. Each fluid ounce contained approximately 6 milligrams of cocaine, enough to produce a noticeable stimulant effect without overwhelming the drinker. Mariani was not just a chemist, he was a marketing genius centuries ahead of his time. He understood that endorsements from famous people could drive sales, and he systematically collected testimonials from the most celebrated figures of his era. Pope Leo XIII was so impressed with Vin Mariani that he awarded Mariani a Vatican gold medal and allowed his image to appear in the wine's advertisements. Queen Victoria reportedly kept a supply in her household. Thomas Edison, the wizard of Menlo Park, credited Vin Mariani with helping him through long nights of invention. Ulysses S. Grant, former president and Civil War hero, drank Vin Mariani while writing his memoirs during his final cancer-ravaged days. The list of endorsements grew to include writers like Jules Verne and Alexandre Dumas, the actress Sarah Bernhardt, and countless other luminaries. Vin Mariani became fashionable among the European elite, a sophisticated pleasure that conferred status upon those who consumed it. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, an American pharmacist was watching Mariani's success with great interest. His name was John Stith Pemberton, a Confederate veteran from Atlanta, Georgia, who bore the scars of a saber wound received during the Battle of Columbus and who struggled with addiction to morphine, which had been prescribed for his pain. Pemberton created his own coca wine in 1885, which he called Pemberton's French Wine Coca. But when Atlanta and Fulton County passed prohibition legislation the following year, Pemberton was forced to reformulate his product as a non-alcoholic beverage. He replaced the wine with sugar syrup, added cola nut extract for additional caffeine, mixed in various flavoring oils, and created a fountain drink that he registered under a new name. He called it Coca-Cola. Yes, the world's most famous soft drink began its existence as a cocaine-infused medicine marketed as a cure for headaches, fatigue, and morphine addiction. However, the medical applications of cocaine were about to explode beyond anything Pemberton or Mariani could have imagined. In 1884, a young Viennese physician named Sigmund Freud, not yet the father of psychoanalysis, but merely an ambitious neurologist searching for his breakthrough discovery, began experimenting with cocaine.
Freud had read about the substance in American medical journals and was intrigued by reports of its stimulant properties. He obtained a sample from the pharmaceutical company Merck and began taking it himself while carefully recording his observations. Freud was enchanted. He wrote that cocaine produced exhilaration and lasting euphoria, which in no way differs from the normal euphoria of the healthy person. He felt that his thinking became sharper, his energy increased, his depression lifted. He began recommending cocaine to friends, colleagues, and patients. He sent samples to his fiancée, Martha, urging her to take it to give her rosy cheeks. He published a paper called Über Coca, in which he praised cocaine's potential applications for treating depression, digestive disorders, morphine addiction, and various other conditions. For a brief moment, Sigmund Freud positioned himself as cocaine's greatest champion.
But Freud's colleague, Karl Kohler, would achieve the breakthrough that truly transformed medicine. Kohler was an ophthalmologist, and he had been searching for years for a way to anesthetize the eye for surgery. Previous attempts at using general anesthesia for eye operations were dangerous. Patients needed to be conscious enough to control their eye movements, but the pain of surgery made this nearly impossible. Kohler remembered Freud mentioning that cocaine numbed his tongue, and he wondered whether it might do the same for other tissues. In the summer of 1884, Kohler dissolved cocaine in water and applied drops of the solution to the eyes of laboratory animals. The results were dramatic. The eyes became completely insensitive to touch and pain while remaining fully functional. Kohler presented his findings at a medical conference in Heidelberg in September of that year, and within months, surgeons around the world were using cocaine as a local anesthetic. It was nothing short of revolutionary. For the first time, doctors could perform delicate operations on conscious patients without causing agony. The age of local anesthesia had begun. The third chapter reveals the shadow that followed these bright discoveries, the dark side of cocaine that would gradually emerge as more and more people encountered the drug. For in the midst of all this medical enthusiasm, in the midst of the testimonials and the scientific papers and the surgical breakthroughs, something troubling was happening. People were becoming addicted. William Stewart Halsted, one of the founding physicians of Johns Hopkins Hospital and a pioneer of modern surgical techniques, began using cocaine to experiment with nerve block anesthesia in 1884. He would inject cocaine into his own nerves to test its effects, mapping out the sensory pathways of the human body with remarkable precision. But the experiments had a cost. Halsted became addicted to cocaine, his behavior growing erratic, his legendary surgical skills deteriorating. His colleagues eventually intervened, sending him on a rehabilitation cruise to the Caribbean. The treatment involved weaning him off cocaine using morphine, which succeeded only in giving Halsted a second addiction. He spent the rest of his distinguished career secretly addicted to morphine, a fact known to only a few trusted colleagues. Freud's experience was similarly cautionary. He had recommended cocaine to his friend Ernst von Fleischl-Marxaw, who was addicted to morphine after surgery for an infected thumb. Freud believed cocaine would cure the morphine addiction, and indeed, Fleischl-Marxaw stopped taking morphine, but he replaced it with cocaine, consuming ever larger doses, eventually developing cocaine psychosis, complete with hallucinations of insects crawling beneath his skin. He died in 1891, his final years marked by suffering that Freud had inadvertently caused. Freud quietly retreated from his advocacy of cocaine, rarely mentioning it in his later work, though the episode haunted him for the rest of his life.
By the 1890s, reports of cocaine addiction were appearing throughout the medical literature. Doctors who had initially praised the drug as a cure-all began publishing warnings. The pharmaceutical companies that had eagerly marketed cocaine products began to face criticism, but the genie was out of the bottle. Cocaine had become too popular, too profitable, and too widely available to simply disappear. Patent medicines containing cocaine flooded the market. Coca-Cola continued to include coca extract in its formula, though the company would later claim the cocaine content was negligible. Cocaine was sold as a cure for toothache, sinusitis, hay fever, and asthma. It was marketed to women as a treatment for menstrual cramps and to children as an ingredient in teething drops. An entire generation was being casually exposed to a substance whose addictive potential was only beginning to be understood.
And then came the racial dimension, the layer of our story that intersects directly with the history of crack cocaine in America's inner cities. In the early 20th century, as concern about cocaine grew, that concern became inextricably tangled with racism. Newspapers began running sensationalized stories about cocaine use among Black Americans, particularly in the South. These stories were often fabricated or wildly exaggerated, but they painted a picture of drug-crazed Black men committing crimes against white people, especially white women. The stories claimed that cocaine gave Black men superhuman strength, that it made them impervious to bullets, that it inflamed their sexual desires into uncontrollable violence. These claims were scientifically baseless, but they served a purpose. They stoked white fears at a time when Jim Crow segregation was being institutionalized throughout the South. They provided justification for increased police violence against Black communities. And they helped build political momentum for the criminalization of cocaine. In 1914, the United States Congress passed the Harrison Narcotics Tax Act, which regulated and taxed the production and distribution of opiates and coca products. While the act did not technically outlaw cocaine, it made cocaine so difficult to obtain legally that it effectively drove the drug underground. Doctors who continued to prescribe cocaine to addicts faced prosecution. Pharmacies that sold cocaine without prescriptions were raided and shuttered. The era of open legal cocaine use in America was ending. By 1922, cocaine was officially banned except for limited medical purposes. The drug that had been celebrated by popes and presidents, that had revolutionized surgery and filled the coffers of pharmaceutical companies, was now a criminal substance. But making a substance illegal does not make it disappear. It merely changes the nature of its distribution. For the next several decades, cocaine retreated into the shadows, becoming an underground drug associated with jazz musicians, Hollywood stars, and organized crime. It became expensive and exclusive, a party favor for the wealthy rather than a mass-market product. Most Americans had little contact with cocaine, and public concern about the drug faded. The attention of drug enforcement shifted to other substances, marijuana in the 1930s, heroin in the 1950s and 60s, LSD and other psychedelics in the counterculture era. Cocaine seemed almost quaint by comparison, a relic of an earlier, more innocent age of drug experimentation. As we approach the modern age, we must turn our attention to the dramatic resurgence of cocaine in the 1970s and the transformation that would birth crack cocaine. The year 1970 marked a turning point in American drug culture. The optimism of the 1960s counterculture had curdled into something darker. The Vietnam War ground on. Cities burned in racial unrest. The economy staggered under the weight of inflation,
And cocaine, which had been gradually increasing in popularity throughout the late 1960s, began its ascent toward becoming the drug of the decade. Several factors converged to make the 1970s the decade of cocaine. First, changing drug supply routes meant that South American cocaine was entering the United States in unprecedented quantities. Colombian traffickers were developing sophisticated smuggling networks, using small aircraft to fly cocaine across the Caribbean, using fishing boats to make coastal drops, using corrupt officials to look the other way. The price of cocaine began to fall even as purity increased, making the drug accessible to a wider market. Second, cultural attitudes toward cocaine were shifting. The drug was portrayed in popular culture as glamorous, sophisticated, and relatively harmless. It was the drug of choice at Studio 54, the legendary New York nightclub where celebrities danced until dawn. It was the drug of Wall Street traders, Hollywood producers, and rock stars. Unlike heroin, which was associated with desperate junkies nodding off in abandoned buildings, cocaine was seen as a status symbol, a drug for winners.
The television show Saturday Night Live aired sketches that joked about cocaine use. Movies like Annie Hall included scenes where characters casually snorted cocaine at parties. Musicians from all genres wrote songs that referenced cocaine with affection or admiration. The drug seemed ubiquitous in certain circles, and those circles set the cultural tone for the nation. An entire generation came to believe that cocaine was safe, that it was not addictive, that it was merely a sophisticated pleasure with no lasting consequences. This belief was catastrophically wrong, but it took time for the truth to emerge. Meanwhile, in impoverished communities across America, a different chemistry experiment was taking shape. Pure cocaine hydrochloride, the white powder that was snorted or injected, was expensive. A gram might cost anywhere from $75 to $100, and a serious habit could run to hundreds of dollars per day. For people in poor communities, especially the poor Black and Latino neighborhoods of major cities, cocaine at these prices was simply unaffordable. But there was another form of cocaine that had been known for years in certain circles: freebase cocaine. The chemistry of freebase cocaine is relatively simple. Cocaine hydrochloride is a salt, meaning it combines the cocaine alkaloid with hydrochloric acid. This salt form is water-soluble, which is why it can be snorted or dissolved for injection. But the salt form has a high melting point and decomposes before it can be effectively smoked. By converting the salt back to the base form, by removing the hydrochloric acid, you create a substance that vaporizes at lower temperatures and can be inhaled. The resulting high is far more intense than snorting because the cocaine reaches the brain within seconds rather than minutes. The high is also shorter, lasting perhaps 15 to 20 minutes, which means users quickly want another hit. The freebase process in its original form was dangerous. It involved using flammable ether to convert the cocaine, and accidents were common. The most famous of these accidents occurred on June 9, 1980, when the comedian Richard Pryor suffered severe burns over more than half his body when the ether he was using to freebase cocaine ignited. Pryor nearly died, and his recovery took months. The incident made national headlines and brought the dangers of freebasing to public attention. But even as the dangers of freebase were becoming known, a simpler method of creating smokable cocaine was emerging. Instead of using ether, this method used ordinary baking soda. Cocaine hydrochloride was dissolved in water, baking soda was added, and the mixture was heated. The heat caused the cocaine to precipitate out as solid rocks that could be broken into smaller pieces and smoked. The popping or cracking sound these rocks made when heated gave the new form of cocaine its name, crack. What happened next would shock the world. The exact origins of crack are disputed. Some accounts place its invention in the late 1970s on the West Coast. Others trace it to the Caribbean, particularly the Bahamas, where freebase smoking had been popular among locals for years. But wherever it originated, crack exploded onto the American drug scene in the early 1980s with a force that caught everyone by surprise. The appeal of crack was simple and terrible. It was cheap. A single hit of crack might cost as little as $2 or $3, bringing the intense high of cocaine within reach of people who could never afford powder. It was easy to make, requiring no special equipment beyond a kitchen stove and common household ingredients. It was incredibly addictive, the short and intense high creating a compulsive cycle of use that could capture someone within days or even hours of their first hit. And because it was smoked rather than injected, it seemed safer than heroin, even though the crack high was actually more intensely addictive.
By 1984, crack had established itself in the major cities of the United States: Los Angeles, New York, Miami, Detroit, Chicago, Philadelphia, Washington, D.C. In city after city, crack arrived and devastated entire neighborhoods. The drug seemed almost purpose-built to create maximum destruction. Its low price meant that anyone could try it. Its intense high meant that many who tried it wanted more immediately. Its short duration meant that users needed to keep using to maintain their high, burning through whatever money they had and then turning to crime to get more. Its easy production meant that anyone could become a dealer, and many did, including teenagers who saw drug dealing as their only path to economic success. Let me tell you about a man named Ricky Ross, though not the rapper who later borrowed his name. Ricky Donnell Ross, often called Freeway Rick, was born in 1960 in Troop, Texas, and raised in south-central Los Angeles. Ross was functionally illiterate. He had made it through high school without learning to read because teachers had passed him along rather than addressing his learning disability. He had hoped to attend college on a tennis scholarship, but that dream died when the NCAA discovered he could not read. Stranded in South Central with no education and no prospects, Ross drifted into the drug trade. In the early 1980s, he met a Nicaraguan exile named Oscar Danilo Blandon, who had connections to the Contra rebels fighting the Sandinista government in Nicaragua. Blandon was selling cocaine to raise money for the Contra cause, and he found in Ross an eager and talented customer. Ross had an almost supernatural gift for drug dealing. He was utterly ruthless in his business practices, but he was also innovative, efficient, and organized. He bought cocaine from Blandon in bulk, converted it to crack, and sold it through an ever-expanding network of street dealers. At his peak, he was moving millions of dollars worth of crack per week. He expanded beyond Los Angeles, establishing distribution networks in St. Louis, Cincinnati, New Orleans, and other cities. He became so successful that federal officials later estimated he sold hundreds of millions of dollars worth of crack during his career. And through it all, Ross remained close to the community he was destroying. He lived in South Central. He employed local people. He gave money to local causes. He was, in the eyes of many, a success story, a local boy who had made good, even as the product he sold was tearing families apart, filling prisons, and ending lives. The connection between Ross and Blandon would later become enormously controversial when journalist Gary Webb revealed in 1996 that Blandon had been protected by the CIA due to his connections to the Contras. Webb's Dark Alliance series in the San Jose Mercury News suggested that the CIA had knowingly allowed cocaine to flood into black communities to fund anti-communist rebels in Central America. The implications were explosive. Here was evidence, or at least the appearance of evidence, that the government had been complicit in the very epidemic that was destroying inner-city America. The CIA vehemently denied the allegations, and major newspapers attacked Webb's reporting. Webb's career was destroyed. He died by suicide in 2004. But the questions he raised have never been fully answered, and the possibility that government agencies turned a blind eye to drug trafficking for political reasons remains one of the most disturbing aspects of the crack era. How did this happen? How did America allow an epidemic of such devastating proportions to unfold? To answer that question, we must understand the political context of the 1980s. Ronald Reagan had been elected president in 1980 on a platform that emphasized law and order, reduced government spending, and a tough stance against drugs. His administration launched what became known as the War on Drugs, a massive expansion of federal drug enforcement that would reshape the criminal justice system for decades. Nancy Reagan became the face of the administration's anti-drug efforts with her Just Say No campaign, which encouraged young people to simply refuse drugs when offered. The campaign was well-intentioned, but deeply inadequate to the scale of the problem.
As crack spread, the Reagan administration responded with increasingly harsh policies. The 1986 Anti-Drug Abuse Act created mandatory minimum sentences for drug offenses, including a provision that would become infamous, the 100-to-1 disparity between crack and powder cocaine. Under this law, possessing 5 grams of crack triggered a mandatory 5-year sentence, the same as possessing 500 grams of powder cocaine. The stated rationale was that crack was more addictive and more associated with violence. But critics noted that the practical effect was to punish crack users, who were predominantly black, far more harshly than powder cocaine users, who were predominantly white. Two chemically identical substances, distinguished only by the addition of baking soda, carried sentences that differed by a factor of 100. The political pressure to appear tough on crack was immense. On June 19, 1986, Len Bias, a basketball star from the University of Maryland who had just been drafted by the Boston Celtics, died of a cocaine overdose. Bias's death was a national sensation. Here was a young, healthy, talented athlete at the peak of his potential, struck down by drugs. The public outrage was enormous. Congress rushed to pass the Anti-Drug Abuse Act with minimal debate. Representatives and senators competed to appear tougher than their colleagues, adding amendment after amendment that increased penalties, expanded enforcement powers, and restricted judicial discretion. The bill passed with overwhelming bipartisan support. Looking back, it is difficult to overstate how much Len Bias's death shaped American drug policy. A single tragic event created the political momentum for a legal regime that would incarcerate hundreds of thousands of people over the following decades. The impact of these policies on black communities was catastrophic. Before crack and the war on drugs, black Americans were incarcerated at roughly the same rate as white Americans. By the 1990s, black Americans made up roughly 40% of the prison population, despite being only 13% of the general population. Young black men in urban areas saw their friends, brothers, and fathers disappearing into the prison system. 1 in 3 black men born in 2001 can expect to be incarcerated at some point in their lives, compared to 1 in 17 white men.
These statistics are inseparable from the crack era and the policies it inspired. Entire neighborhoods were destabilized as fathers, mothers, sons, and daughters were removed to serve lengthy prison sentences for offenses that would have drawn far shorter sentences for powder cocaine. But the devastation extended far beyond incarceration. Crack tore through families with a violence that is difficult to comprehend from a distance. Let me tell you about the children of the crack era, the generation that came of age in the 1980s and early 1990s in the hardest-hit neighborhoods. These children watched their parents disappear into addiction. They watched their mothers sell themselves for hits. They watched their fathers become hollowed-out husks, desperate for the next rock. They were neglected, abused, abandoned. They grew up in homes where the only constant was chaos. Foster care systems across the country were overwhelmed with children whose parents could no longer care for them. Grandmothers and aunts took in nieces and nephews whose parents had vanished into the smoke. An entire generation grew up without stable parenting, without guidance, without the basic emotional foundations that most children take for granted. The term crack baby entered the popular vocabulary, referring to infants born to mothers who had used crack during pregnancy. News reports painted a terrifying picture of these children, destined for severe developmental disabilities, unable to learn, unable to love, a lost generation that would burden society for decades. The reality, as later research revealed, was considerably more nuanced. Prenatal cocaine exposure does cause harm, but the harm is often subtle and manageable with proper intervention. Many crack babies grew up to be perfectly normal adults. The apocalyptic predictions of the 1980s were driven more by racism and moral panic than by science. But the stigma attached to these children lasted for years, affecting how teachers and social workers treated them, affecting their own self-image, affecting their opportunities in ways that research is only beginning to understand. Meanwhile, the violence associated with crack reached levels that seemed almost incomprehensible. The crack trade was uniquely violent for several reasons. The drug was so addictive that users would do almost anything to get their next hit, including robbery and assault. The drug was so profitable that dealers would do almost anything to protect their territory, including murder. The drug was so easy to make that markets were fragmented among many small operators, each competing viciously for customers. Unlike heroin markets, which tended to be controlled by hierarchical organized crime groups that imposed a certain order, crack markets were anarchic. Teenagers with guns settled disputes that in other businesses would be resolved through negotiation or law. The murder rate in the United States, which had been declining since the early 1980s, suddenly reversed course and began to climb. Cities that had seemed to be recovering from the urban crisis of the 1970s found themselves plunged back into chaos. Washington, D.C., the nation's capital, earned the grim nickname Murder Capital as its homicide rate soared to levels not seen in decades. Innocent bystanders were caught in crossfire. Children playing in parks were killed by stray bullets. The fear that gripped inner-city neighborhoods in the late 1980s and early 1990s is difficult to convey to those who did not experience it. People were afraid to leave their homes. They were afraid to let their children play outside. They were afraid that any moment might bring death. As we continue our journey through this difficult history, we must turn our attention to how different communities and institutions responded to the crisis. The police response was shaped by the political imperatives of the war on drugs. Departments across the country adopted aggressive tactics, stop and frisk searches, drug sweeps through public housing projects, mass arrests for minor offenses. The theory was that aggressive enforcement of low-level crimes would prevent more serious crimes and disrupt drug markets. In practice, these tactics often alienated the very communities that police were supposed to protect. Black residents of inner cities came to see police not as protectors, but as occupiers, not as servants of the community, but as instruments of oppression. The tensions that would explode in events like the 1992 Los Angeles riots following the Rodney King verdict were building throughout the crack era. The medical community struggled to respond to the addiction crisis. Crack addiction did not respond well to the treatment modalities that had been developed for other drugs. The intensity of crack craving, the speed with which tolerance developed, the depression that followed each high, all made treatment extraordinarily difficult. Relapse rates were discouragingly high. Funding for treatment was limited, especially compared to the billions being poured into enforcement. An addict who wanted help often faced long waiting lists, inadequate services, and treatment providers who had little experience with crack specifically. Many treatment professionals privately believed that crack addiction was essentially untreatable, that once someone was hooked, they were lost. The faith community stepped into the gap where other institutions failed. Black churches in inner-city neighborhoods became centers of resistance and hope. Ministers preached against drug use from their pulpits. Congregations organized neighborhood watches. Church basements became de facto treatment centers where addicts could find counseling and support. Groups like Men of Valor and Teen Challenge offered faith-based recovery programs that provided structure and community. The role of these religious organizations in combating crack is often overlooked in historical accounts, but for many people in affected communities, the church was the only institution that seemed to care about their survival. Let me tell you about a woman I'll call Rosa, though that is not her real name. Rosa was born in the South Bronx in 1968 into a family already struggling with poverty and instability. Her father left when she was young. Her mother worked double shifts to keep food on the table. Rosa was a bright child, earning good grades in school despite the chaos around her. She had dreams of becoming a nurse. And then, in 1985, when she was 17 years old, a boy she liked offered her a hit of something he called Ready Rock. That first hit changed everything. Rosa would later describe the sensation as unlike anything she had ever experienced. Every problem in her life, every worry, every fear, every insecurity simply vanished, replaced by a warmth and euphoria that seemed to fill the entire universe. For 15 minutes, she was completely, perfectly happy. And when the high faded, when the world came crashing back with all its harsh edges and cold realities, she wanted nothing more than to feel that way again. Within weeks, Rosa had dropped out of school. Within months, she was selling herself on the streets to fund her habit. She became pregnant twice and lost both babies, one to miscarriage and one to foster care. She was arrested multiple times, cycling through the Rikers Island jail system. She was beaten, raped, and left for dead in an alley. She contracted HIV. By 1992, she weighed less than 90 pounds and looked decades older than her 24 years. She had given up all hope of recovery. And then, one winter night, she stumbled into a church in the Bronx looking for shelter from the cold. A woman there, a deaconess who had been running an informal ministry to addicts for years, took one look at Rosa and said, "Child, God has a plan for you." That encounter was the beginning of Rosa's long, difficult road to recovery. It took years. There were relapses. There were moments when she nearly gave up. But today, Rosa is alive. She has been clean for more than 2 decades. She works as a counselor in the same neighborhood where she once sold herself for crack. Her story is one of countless similar stories, stories of people who found their way back from the brink, often through faith, through community, through human connections that refused to let them go. But not everyone found their way back. The crack epidemic claimed thousands of lives directly through overdose and violence, and it claimed countless more indirectly through the spiral of poverty, incarceration, and despair that it created. The devastation was not evenly distributed. Some neighborhoods were destroyed, while others, often just a few miles away, went largely untouched. The geography of crack followed the geography of inequality, concentrating its damage in the communities that were already most vulnerable. This was not coincidence. It was the predictable result of policies that had segregated American cities by race and class, that had denied economic opportunity to entire communities, that had created the conditions of desperation in which crack would thrive. The late 1980s and early 1990s marked the peak of the crack epidemic. Murder rates were at their highest. Addiction was most widespread. Fear was most pervasive. But even as the crisis reached its apex, the seeds of its decline were being planted. Several factors contributed to the gradual reduction in crack use that began in the mid-1990s. First, a new generation was coming of age that had witnessed the destruction crack caused firsthand. Young people who had watched their parents and older siblings destroyed by crack were less likely to try it themselves. The drug lost its glamour, if it had ever had any, and came to be seen as the path to ruin. Second, the violence associated with crack markets began to stabilize as the chaotic competition of the early years gave way to more established territorial arrangements. The death toll remained high, but it was no longer spiraling upward. Third, law enforcement did eventually disrupt some of the major distribution networks, making crack somewhat harder to obtain in some areas. And there were broader social and economic forces at play. The economy improved significantly in the 1990s, with the long expansion of the Clinton years bringing unemployment to its lowest levels in decades. Jobs became more available, even in inner cities that had been written off as hopeless. Community development organizations worked to rebuild neighborhoods that had been devastated. The combination of economic opportunity and community investment began to create alternatives to the drug trade for young people who might otherwise have been drawn into it.
But while crack use declined, its legacy remained. The prisons were still full. The families were still broken. The communities were still struggling. And the policies enacted during the peak of the crisis were still on the books. Those 100-to-1 sentencing disparities continued to send black men to prison for decades, while white men convicted of equivalent powder cocaine offenses received fractions of the punishment. The mandatory minimums continued to strip judges of the discretion to consider individual circumstances. The war on drugs continued to consume billions of dollars that might have been spent on treatment, education, and economic development. Today, we still grapple with the legacy of the crack epidemic. The 2010 Fair Sentencing Act reduced the crack to powder sentencing disparity from 100-to-1 to 18-to-1, a significant improvement, but still far from parity. The First Step Act of 2018 made this change retroactive, allowing some prisoners sentenced under the old guidelines to petition for reduced sentences. Thousands of people have been released as a result, but thousands more remain behind bars, serving sentences that most experts now agree were grossly disproportionate to their offenses. The racial disparities in the criminal justice system that the crack era exacerbated remain stubbornly entrenched.
Black Americans continue to be arrested, prosecuted, and incarcerated for drug offenses at rates far exceeding their share of the population or their actual rate of drug use. The distrust between police and minority communities that intensified during the crack years remains a central challenge for American democracy, exploding periodically into protests and civil unrest, most recently in the summer of 2020 following the murder of George Floyd. And the drugs keep coming. Crack itself never disappeared entirely. It remains available in many American cities, though its use is a fraction of what it was at the epidemic's peak. But other drugs have risen to take its place. The opioid epidemic of the 2010s and 2020s has killed far more people than crack ever did, with overdose deaths reaching record levels year after year. Fentanyl, a synthetic opioid far more potent than heroin, has emerged as the deadliest drug in American history. Methamphetamine remains a scourge in rural and suburban communities. The fundamental drivers of drug epidemics, poverty, despair, lack of opportunity, trauma, mental illness, have not been addressed. We have changed the drugs we abuse, but we have not changed the conditions that drive abuse. There's a deeper lesson here, one that extends beyond the specifics of crack cocaine to encompass something fundamental about human nature and human society. Drugs are not simply chemical compounds. They are symptoms. They are symptoms of pain that cannot be addressed, of needs that cannot be met, of hopes that have been crushed so completely that only artificial euphoria remains. The crack epidemic was not caused by a chemical formula, or by Colombian cartels, or by the CIA, or by any single factor. It was caused by decades of policy choices that concentrated poverty in certain neighborhoods, denied opportunity to certain people, and then responded to the predictable results with punishment rather than help. It was caused by a society that had written off entire communities as expendable, that did not care what happened in the inner cities as long as the problems stayed contained. It was caused by failures of empathy on a massive scale. And yet, even in the darkest moments of the crack era, there were lights. There were the grandmothers who raised their grandchildren when their own children could not. There were the teachers who showed up every day in schools that seemed designed for failure, who believed in their students when no one else did. There were the ministers and social workers and community organizers who refused to abandon their neighborhoods. There were recovering addicts who found their way back and then reached out their hands to help others still struggling. There was Rosa, and there were thousands like her, people who should have died but didn't, people who should have been lost but were found. The story of crack cocaine is not over. It is a story that continues in the lives of everyone who was touched by the epidemic, in the communities that are still recovering, in the policies that are still being debated, in the children and grandchildren of those who suffered. It is a story that asks us uncomfortable questions about who we are as a society, about what we value, about whom we choose to help and whom we choose to punish. These are questions without easy answers. But they are questions we must continue to ask if we hope to learn from this history, rather than simply repeat it.
As we look back across the centuries we have traveled tonight, from the mist-shrouded peaks of the ancient Andes to the shattered streets of inner-city America, we can see patterns that recur again and again. We see a substance of great power discovered and exploited. We see that exploitation causing harm. We see the harm falling disproportionately on the most vulnerable. We see responses that often make the problem worse. We see recovery, slow and painful but real. And we see the cycle beginning again,
with a new substance, a new generation, a new set of victims. Perhaps that is the truest lesson of this history. Not that drugs are evil, though they can be destructive beyond imagination. Not that people are weak, though we are all susceptible to suffering and the desire to escape it. But that we are connected to one another in ways we often fail to recognize. The choices we make as a society, the policies we enact, the priorities we set, ripple outward across generations. The coca leaf that sustained ancient laborers in the Andes is the same substance that, transformed by chemistry and circumstance, devastated American cities thousands of miles away and thousands of years later. Everything is connected. What we do to the least among us, we do to ourselves. The night grows late now, and the weight of this history settles over us like a blanket. So many lives, so much suffering, so many stories that will never be fully told. And yet the world continues to turn. The sun will rise tomorrow over the same mountains where coca has grown for millennia. Children will be born who know nothing of the crack epidemic, who will learn about it in history books if they learn about it at all. The survivors will continue their work of healing and rebuilding. The dead will remain dead, but they will not be entirely forgotten, not as long as we tell their stories, not as long as we remember. There is comfort in that, perhaps, the knowledge that even the most terrible chapters of history eventually come to an end, the understanding that human resilience is extraordinary, that communities can rebuild, that individuals can recover, that hope can survive even the most determined assaults. The crack epidemic was one of the darkest chapters in American history, but it was not the final chapter. The story continues, as all stories do, unfolding in ways we cannot yet predict, carrying within it the seeds of both tragedy and redemption. And so we come to the end of our journey together, though in truth no journey ever really ends. What we have explored tonight is merely a fraction of a story that encompasses millions of lives, that stretches across continents and centuries, that touches on questions of chemistry and commerce, of politics and poverty, of crime and punishment, of addiction and recovery, of despair and hope. It is a story that invites further exploration, that deserves more attention than any single telling can provide. If you have stayed with me through these long hours, if you have listened as the night deepened around you, I thank you for your patience and your attention. Perhaps you are drifting now, your eyes growing heavy, the words washing over you in gentle waves. That is as it should be. There is a time for learning and a time for rest. The knowledge we have shared will still be here in the morning, woven into your understanding of the world, shaping how you see the history that surrounds us all. Rest now. Let the last echoes of this story fade into silence. Let the night embrace you. Tomorrow the world will still be here, with all its complexities and contradictions. The legacy of crack cocaine will still be with us, in the policies we live under, in the communities we inhabit, in the memories we carry. But we will be better equipped to understand that legacy, to grapple with its implications, to work toward a future that learns from the past rather than repeating it. The coca leaf still grows in the Andes. The mountains still rise toward the sky. The story continues. Good night.